March 15, 1945. 0630 hours. The makeshift shelter beneath what remained of downtown Yokohama. Mrs. Akiko Tanaka clutched her 3-month-old daughter Yuki against her chest, listening to the distant rumble of American bombers overhead. For 6 months she had survived on scraps and hope, watching her breast milk dry up from malnutrition while her baby grew weaker each day. What she and every desperate mother in that shelter believed was that the American soldiers would show no mercy to Japanese civilians. They had been told stories of brutality, of executions, of children torn from their mothers' arms. None of them suspected that within hours, the scent of cooking rice would lead them to a discovery that would shatter everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Akiko's story began 3 weeks earlier, when the firebombing of Tokyo had forced her family to flee south. Her husband Hiroshi had been conscripted 8 months prior, leaving her alone with baby Yuki and her elderly mother-in-law, grandmother Sato. The old woman had died during their second night of walking, collapsing on the roadside from exhaustion and hunger. Akiko had been forced to leave her body there, wrapped only in a torn kimono, while she continued toward what she hoped would be safety. The mathematics of survival were brutal in wartime Japan. Before the war, the average Japanese family consumed 400 calories per day. By March 1945, civilian rations had dropped to 200 calories, and even those were rarely available. Mothers like Akiko were receiving perhaps 800 calories daily, barely enough to sustain their own lives, let alone produce milk for their infants. Medical records from the period show that infant mortality rates in major Japanese cities had climbed to 40% by early 1945. Akiko had joined a group of 12 other women, all with children under 2 years old, all fleeing the devastation of their hometowns. They called themselves the Milk Mothers, because their shared bond was the desperate attempt to keep their babies fed. Mrs. Emi Watanabe had lost her husband at Iwo Jima, and carried twin boys, both born premature. Mrs. Yuki Yamamoto, barely 18 years old, held her daughter Sakura, born just 6 weeks before the bombing began. Each woman carried stories of loss that would have broken stronger people, yet they pressed on with the singular focus of keeping their children alive. The shelter they found beneath the ruins of a department store had become home to over 60 people. The space reeked of unwashed bodies, sickness and despair. There was no electricity, no running water, and certainly no food. The women took turns caring for each other's babies, while the others ventured out to search for anything edible. They stripped bark from trees, boiled leather shoes, and picked through garbage dumps looking for scraps the rats hadn't claimed. Akiko had been a mathematics teacher before the war, accustomed to order, logic, and solutions. Now her world had been reduced to the most primitive calculations. How long could she survive on 1 rice ball? How many ounces of dirty water could she drink without becoming too sick to care for Yuki? How much weight could her baby lose before there would be no coming back? These equations had no clean answers, only the relentless march toward an outcome she refused to accept. The other mothers in the shelter looked to Akiko as their unofficial leader. At 26, she was neither the oldest nor the youngest, but she possessed a calm determination that gave the others hope. When Mrs. Suzuki's baby developed a fever, Akiko organized the women to take turns holding the child, using their body heat to break the fever when no medicine was available. When food ran out completely, she was the one who ventured into the most dangerous areas of the city, returning with whatever she could find. By March 14th, the situation had become critical. Baby Yuki hadn't had a proper feeding in 36 hours. The infant's crying had grown weak, then stopped altogether, which terrified Akiko more than the loudest wails ever could. The other babies in the shelter were in similar condition. Mrs. Watanabe's twins had developed a rash from malnutrition, and little Sakura had begun showing signs of severe dehydration. The mothers knew they were racing against time, but they had nowhere left to run. The night of March 14th brought another wave of bombing, though this time it seemed more distant. The women huddled together in the deepest part of the shelter, trying to shield their babies from the dust and debris that rained down with each explosion. Akiko found herself calculating again, But this time the mathematics were different. If the bombing was moving away from their area, it meant ground troops would likely follow. American soldiers would be sweeping through within days, perhaps hours. Everything they had been told suggested this would mean death or worse. The government propaganda had filled their minds with images of American brutality, stories of soldiers who killed civilians without mercy, who took pleasure in the suffering of women and children. The radio broadcasts, when there had been radio broadcasts, painted pictures of an enemy without human compassion. Yet, as Akiko held her dying daughter, she began to wonder if facing these monsters might be preferable to watching Yuki slowly starve to death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn on March 15th brought an eerie quiet. The bombing had stopped, but so had most other sounds of the city. No traffic, no voices, no signs of normal life. Akiko emerged from the shelter first, leaving Yuki in the care of Mrs. Yamamoto, and climbed through the rubble to street level. What she saw was devastation beyond imagination. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now nothing more than twisted metal and ash. The very geography of her city had been altered. But then she smelled something that made her freeze in place. Rice. Not just any rice, but rice being cooked properly, with care and attention. The aroma was rich and full, suggesting not just quantity but quality. It was the smell of rice, prepared by someone who had enough of it to cook it well. Someone who wasn't desperately stretching every grain. For a moment, Akiko thought she might be hallucinating from hunger, that her mind was playing cruel tricks on her. She followed the scent like a woman possessed, climbing over debris and navigating through streets she no longer recognized. The smell grew stronger as she moved east, toward what had been the commercial district. Her teacher's mind, even in its weakened state, noted the logical progression. Someone with enough rice to cook it properly would need a safe place to do so. They would need water, fuel, and security. These were not things that desperate civilians possessed. 3 blocks from the shelter, Akiko crested a small hill of rubble and saw something that made her heart stop. In the courtyard of a destroyed school, she could see smoke rising from what appeared to be field kitchens. But these weren't Japanese field kitchens. The equipment was too sophisticated, too well maintained. And moving around these kitchens were men in uniforms she had seen only in propaganda posters. American soldiers. The enemy was here, and they were cooking. Her first instinct was to run, to race back to the shelter and warn the others. But something held her in place. The soldiers weren't acting like the monsters from the propaganda. They moved with purpose but not urgency, working together efficiently but without the harsh shouting she expected from military operations. And that smell, that wonderful smell of properly cooked rice, seemed to be coming from their direction. From her hiding place behind a collapsed wall, Akiko could observe without being seen. There were perhaps 30 soldiers visible, all wearing the olive-drab uniforms that had become synonymous with invasion and defeat. But their behavior puzzled her. Several were sitting on crates, writing what appeared to be letters. Others were sharing photographs and laughing quietly. These didn't look like the behavior of conquering barbarians preparing for their next act of brutality. The field kitchens were producing more food than 30 soldiers could possibly consume. Large pots of rice, vegetables she couldn't identify from this distance, and what appeared to be some kind of meat. The portions being prepared suggested they were feeding far more people than she could see. But who? Japanese soldiers had retreated weeks ago. Civilians had either fled or were hiding like her group. So who were these Americans planning to feed? As she watched, something happened that challenged everything she thought she knew about her enemies. A small Japanese child, perhaps 4 years old, emerged from behind one of the buildings. The boy was clearly starving, his clothes hanging loose on his tiny frame, his movements unsteady from weakness. Akiko's breath caught in her throat as she waited for the American soldiers' response. This would be the moment that confirmed or challenged everything she had been told about their cruelty. Instead of violence, instead of shouting or weapons being drawn, one of the soldiers simply reached for a bowl and began filling it with rice. He knelt down to the child's level, speaking in what sounded like gentle tones, though Akiko couldn't understand the English words. The boy approached cautiously, clearly terrified but driven by hunger that overrode his fear. The soldier handed him the bowl and a spoon, then sat back to give the child space to eat. What Akiko witnessed next would stay with her for the rest of her life. The American soldier didn't just give the boy food and walk away. He stayed nearby, watching carefully as the child ate, making sure he didn't eat too quickly and make himself sick. When the boy finished, the soldier refilled the bowl without being asked. Other soldiers had noticed the interaction, and instead of disapproval, Akiko saw nods and smiles. They approved of their comrade's kindness. More children began to appear, drawn by the same sense that had attracted Akiko. Each one was met with the same response: food offered freely, gently, with obvious concern for their welfare. The soldiers had clearly been expecting this. They had prepared far more food than they needed, because they knew hungry civilians would come. They had planned for this act of kindness. The implications hit Akiko like a physical blow. These men, these supposed monsters, had used their own resources to prepare food for Japanese civilians. They had anticipated that hungry children would appear, and had made ready to feed them. This wasn't the behavior of an occupying army bent on cruelty. This was the behavior of human beings who saw suffering and chose to alleviate it. She thought of baby Yuki back in the shelter, growing weaker by the hour. She thought of the other mothers, watching their children slowly fade away, while clinging to fears that might be preventing them from seeking help that was apparently available. The mathematics teacher in her began calculating different equations. What if everything they had been told was wrong? What if the choice wasn't between death by starvation and death by enemy cruelty? What if there was a third option they had never been allowed to consider? The internal struggle that followed was perhaps the most difficult of Akiko's life. Every instinct, every piece of propaganda, every warning from authority figures told her to run back to the shelter and hide. But her eyes were showing her evidence that contradicted everything she had been taught to believe. Her daughter was dying, and 30 meters away were people with food who had already demonstrated they would share it with Japanese children. As a teacher, Akiko had always valued evidence over assumption, facts over fear. Now her training warred with her conditioning in a battle that would determine not just her fate, but the fate of 13 infants whose mothers were making life or death decisions based on information that might be completely false. The smell of rice continued to fill the air, a aromatic bridge between two worlds that had been taught to see each other as inhuman. The decision she made in that moment would require more courage than fleeing her burning city, more strength than carrying her baby through weeks of starvation, and more hope than she had allowed herself to feel since the war began. Akiko Tanaka, mathematics teacher turned refugee, took a deep breath and stepped out from behind her hiding place, walking toward the American soldiers with empty hands and a heart full of desperate hope. The 30-meter walk from her hiding place to the American field kitchen felt like crossing between two different worlds. Each step brought Akiko closer to either salvation or the fulfillment of her worst fears. Her legs trembled not just from weeks of malnutrition, but from the weight of a decision that could determine whether 13 babies lived or died. The soldiers had noticed her approach, and she could see them alerting each other, but their body language remained calm, almost gentle. No weapons were drawn, no aggressive postures taken. Sergeant Michael O'Brien was the first to approach her. At 23, he carried himself with the confident bearing of a career soldier, but his eyes held a compassion that surprised Akiko. He spoke in broken Japanese, clearly learned hastily for this exact situation. "Oka-san," he said, using the word for mother, "Anata no kodomo wa doko desu ka?" Where is your child? The fact that he had learned to ask this question, that he assumed she was a mother in need rather than a threat to be neutralized, shifted something fundamental in Akiko's understanding of her situation. Through a combination of broken Japanese, hand gestures, and desperate necessity, Akiko managed to communicate that she had a baby, that there were other mothers, that they were all starving. Sergeant O'Brien listened with the patience of a man who had clearly had this conversation before. When she finished, he called over another soldier, Corporal James Martinez, who spoke slightly better Japanese. Martinez had been studying the language since his deployment, knowing that communication with civilians would be crucial for successful occupation. What happened next challenged every assumption Akiko had held about military efficiency and priorities. Instead of asking her to prove her story or demanding information about Japanese military positions, Sergeant O'Brien immediately began preparing a large container of rice and vegetables. He wasn't just offering to feed Yuki, he was preparing enough food for all 13 babies and their mothers. The scale of immediate generosity overwhelmed Akiko's expectations so completely that she began crying for the first time since leaving Tokyo. Corporal Martinez explained, through his limited Japanese, that the American forces had been specifically instructed to provide humanitarian aid to civilians. They carried extra rations not just for their own extended operations, but explicitly to feed hungry Japanese families. This wasn't an improvised act of individual kindness, it was official military policy. The United States Army had planned for this moment, had allocated resources for this purpose, had trained their soldiers to prioritize civilian welfare alongside military objectives. The logistics of compassion became apparent as more soldiers joined the conversation. Private Robert Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco, had been designated as the unit's civilian liaison, specifically because of his ability to communicate with Asian populations. Staff Sergeant William Thompson had been trained in basic field medicine, with particular focus on treating malnutrition in children. These specializations weren't accidental. The American military had systematically prepared to care for the very people Japan had told their citizens would show no mercy. Akiko learned that this unit, part of the 27th Infantry Division, had been operating under specific orders regarding civilian population since landing on Japanese soil. Every soldier carried cards with basic Japanese phrases focused on offering help rather than demanding surrender. Their field manuals included detailed instructions on recognizing malnutrition in children and elderly civilians. They had been trained to prioritize feeding hungry people above almost all other considerations, because American military doctrine recognized that winning the peace required winning the trust of the civilian population. The conversation revealed layers of preparation that astounded Akiko's teacher's mind. The Americans had studied Japanese dietary requirements and had specifically requested rice suppliers who could provide the short-grain varieties that Japanese civilians would find familiar and digestible. They had learned that many Japanese people were lactose intolerant and had adjusted their nutrition programs accordingly. They carried medicine specifically for treating diseases common among malnourished children. This level of cultural sensitivity and humanitarian planning contradicted everything Akiko had been told about American attitudes toward Japanese people. Sergeant O'Brien handed Akiko a canvas bag filled with enough food for several days, then insisted on accompanying her back to the shelter. His explanation, translated by Corporal Martinez, was both practical and deeply human. Many Japanese civilians were too afraid to approach American soldiers directly, but they might trust another Japanese person who had already made contact. More importantly, babies suffering from severe malnutrition needed to be fed carefully and gradually to avoid making them sicker. The soldiers wanted to ensure the food was distributed properly. The return journey to the shelter became a lesson in the power of evidence over propaganda. As they walked through the devastated streets, Sergeant O'Brien pointed out other American units engaged in humanitarian work. Soldiers were clearing debris from roads not for military advantage, but to allow civilian movement. Medical personnel were treating Japanese civilians alongside American casualties. Engineers were working to restore water pumps that served residential areas rather than strategic facilities. The occupation Akiko was witnessing bore no resemblance to the brutal conquest she had been prepared for. The most powerful moment came when they encountered an elderly Japanese man who had collapsed from exhaustion beside what remained of his home. Without hesitation, Sergeant O'Brien immediately called for a medic while he and Corporal Martinez carefully moved the man to a shaded area. They shared their water with him, offered him food, and stayed with him until medical help arrived. The old man kept repeating "Arigato gozaimasu" through his tears, and Akiko realized she was witnessing the collapse of a worldview built on manufactured hatred. When they reached the shelter, the reaction of the other mothers was everything Akiko had expected and feared. Mrs. Watanabe screamed and tried to hide her twins deeper in the shadows. Mrs. Yamamoto clutched baby Sakura protectively while demanding to know if Akiko had betrayed their location. Several mothers began crying, certain that American soldiers at their hiding place meant death was imminent. The fear in their eyes reflected the same terror Akiko had felt just hours earlier. But Sergeant O'Brien's response to their fear demonstrated a level of emotional intelligence and cultural sensitivity that gradually transformed the atmosphere in the shelter. Instead of being offended by their terror, he immediately sat down and began unpacking food while speaking in the gentlest tones possible. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, making himself appear as non-threatening as possible. When one of the babies began crying, he smiled and made the universal gesture of offering food, holding up a small container of rice porridge specifically prepared for infants. The transformation began with Mrs. Suzuki, whose baby had been running a fever for days. The infant's condition had worsened overnight, and maternal desperation overcame ideological fear. She approached Sergeant O'Brien cautiously, pointing to her baby, and then to the medicine kit she could see attached to his belt. Without needing translation, O'Brien understood. He immediately called for his medic, Private Thompson, who arrived within minutes, carrying supplies that seemed almost magical to the desperate mothers. Private Thompson's examination of the fevered baby was gentle, thorough, and obviously skilled. He diagnosed dehydration complicated by malnutrition, conditions he had clearly encountered before. The treatment he provided included oral rehydration salts, antibiotics for what appeared to be a secondary infection, and detailed instructions for feeding schedules that would help the baby recover without causing digestive distress. Most importantly, he left enough medicine and supplies to treat all the children in the shelter. The sight of an American soldier providing medical care to a Japanese baby with the same attention and skill he would have given an American child fundamentally altered the psychological landscape in the shelter. Mrs. Watanabe was the next to overcome her fear, bringing her twins forward when she saw how gently Private Thompson handled Mrs. Suzuki's baby. Within an hour, all 13 mothers were allowing American medics to examine their children, and every infant was receiving either treatment, food, or both. Corporal Martinez spent considerable time explaining the American military's civilian assistance program. The occupation forces had been specifically trained to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and their rules of engagement prioritize civilian protection above almost all other considerations. They had brought tons of medical supplies intended specifically for Japanese civilian use. They had established feeding stations throughout the occupied territories. Most importantly, they had orders to help Japanese families reunite with missing relatives, and to assist in the rebuilding of civilian infrastructure. The conversation revealed the existence of an entire parallel operation focused on humanitarian aid. While combat units secured military objectives, specialized civilian affairs units were simultaneously working to restore hospitals, schools, and orphanages. The Americans had brought not just weapons and soldiers, but teachers, doctors, engineers, and social workers. Their plan for Japan included not just military defeat, but social reconstruction, based on democratic principles and respect for human dignity. As evening approached, the transformation in the shelter was remarkable. Babies who had been listless from hunger were now alert and feeding properly. Mothers who had spent weeks in terror were cautiously beginning conversations with American soldiers who spoke whatever Japanese they had learned. The most profound change was in the mothers themselves, who were beginning to hope for the first time in months that their children might actually survive the war. Akiko found herself serving as an interpreter and cultural bridge, helping to explain American intentions to mothers who still struggled with disbelief. The evidence was overwhelming, but years of propaganda couldn't be overcome in a single day. Each small kindness, each moment of respect, each demonstration of genuine care for Japanese civilian welfare added weight to a new understanding that was slowly replacing fear with cautious optimism. The evening brought unexpected developments. Word of the American humanitarian aid had spread through the hidden civilian population, and other families began appearing at the shelter. Instead of turning them away or claiming insufficient resources, the American soldiers immediately radioed for additional supplies and personnel. Their response to increased need was to increase aid, not to impose restrictions or demand quotas. The abundance they displayed suggested resources so vast that helping Japanese civilians posed no meaningful burden to their operations. Sergeant O'Brien explained through Corporal Martinez that similar scenes were playing out across occupied Japan. American forces had been specifically prepared for massive civilian displacement and humanitarian crisis. They had brought supplies calculated to feed millions of people for months. They had medical facilities designed to treat not just American casualties, but civilian populations devastated by years of warfare. The scope of planning for post-conflict humanitarian aid revealed a vision of victory that extended far beyond military conquest to genuine social reconstruction. As Akiko settled down for her first peaceful night's sleep in weeks, holding a properly fed and medically treated Yuki against her chest, she reflected on the mathematics that had governed her day. The equations had changed completely. Instead of calculating survival time based on dwindling resources, she was now calculating recovery time based on abundant assistance. Instead of measuring the distance between her current position and inevitable death, she was measuring the distance between despair and hope. The Americans had rewritten every formula that had defined her reality since the war began. The last conversation of the evening was between Akiko and Mrs. Yamamoto, the 18-year-old mother who had been most frightened of the American soldiers. Through tears of relief and confusion, the young woman asked Akiko how it was possible that everything they had been told about their enemies was wrong. Akiko, drawing on her experience as a teacher, replied that the most important lesson in mathematics was learning to check your work against observable evidence. When the results consistently contradict your calculations, the problem isn't with reality, the problem is with your formula. That night, 13 Japanese babies slept with full stomachs for the first time in months, cared for by mothers who were beginning to understand that the end of their war might not mean the end of their world. The Americans had not just brought food and medicine, they had brought a different vision of what victory could look like. Instead of conquest and subjugation, they offered partnership in rebuilding. Instead of punishment for wartime actions, they offered assistance in creating a peaceful future. The scent of rice that had drawn Akiko from her hiding place had led not just to food, but to the possibility of hope itself. The morning of March 16th brought changes that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Akiko woke to the sound of her daughter Yuki, making the strong, healthy cries of a properly fed infant. Around the shelter, other babies were also showing signs of recovery that amazed their mothers. Mrs. Watanabe's twins, who had barely moved for days, were now alert and responsive. Little Sakura had regained enough strength to smile at her mother for the first time in weeks. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, as hope began replacing despair in the hearts of mothers who had almost given up. Sergeant O'Brien arrived with the dawn, bringing news that would expand their world even further. The American command had established a civilian assistance center in the remains of what had once been Yokohama's City Hall. The facility included medical personnel, social workers, and most importantly for the mothers, specialists in reuniting families separated by the war. For women like Akiko, who hadn't heard from their husbands in months, the possibility of finding missing loved ones felt like a miracle almost too wonderful to believe. The journey to the assistance center became a revelation about the scale of American humanitarian operations. Along the route, Akiko saw American soldiers working alongside Japanese civilians to clear rubble from residential streets. There were no overseers with whips, no forced labor gangs, no signs of the brutal occupation she had been conditioned to expect. Instead, she witnessed voluntary cooperation, with American engineering units providing tools and expertise, while Japanese workers contributed local knowledge and labor. The partnership appeared genuinely collaborative. At the assistance center, Akiko encountered Major Sarah Washington, a social worker from Detroit, who had volunteered for overseas duty specifically to help with post-war reconstruction. Major Washington spoke surprisingly fluent Japanese, having studied the language intensively for 8 months in preparation for this assignment. Her presence challenged another assumption Akiko hadn't even realized she held, that all American military personnel would be men focused solely on warfare. Here was a woman in uniform, whose entire mission was healing and rebuilding. Major Washington explained the comprehensive nature of American post-war planning. Beyond immediate humanitarian aid, the occupation forces had brought specialists in education, agriculture, medicine, and civil administration. Their goal wasn't simply to control Japan, but to help the Japanese people build a new society based on democratic principles and human dignity. They had studied successful post-conflict reconstructions throughout history, learning from both successes and failures to create what they believed could be a model for peaceful transition from militaristic dictatorship to democratic self-governance. The family reunification program represented the most emotionally powerful aspect of American humanitarian efforts. Using radio networks, printed bulletins, and a growing database of displaced persons, the Americans were systematically helping Japanese families find each other. They had established communication networks that spanned the entire country, connecting major cities with remote rural areas. For the first time since the bombing began, ordinary Japanese civilians had access to information about relatives in distant locations. When Akiko provided information about her husband, Hiroshi, Major Washington immediately began searching through records that seemed impossibly comprehensive. The Americans had been collecting data on Japanese military personnel captured during various operations, civilian workers displaced from military facilities, and refugees who had registered at other assistance centers. Within an hour, Major Washington found a record that made Akiko's heart stop. Hiroshi Tanaka, former conscript, currently recovering from injuries at an American field hospital near Osaka. The discovery that her husband was not only alive, but receiving medical treatment from American doctors, challenged Akiko's understanding of war itself. In the worldview she had been taught, enemies didn't heal each other's wounded, they finished them off. Prisoners were either executed or worked to death, not given medical care and rehabilitation. Yet the evidence was undeniable. American military hospitals were treating wounded Japanese soldiers with the same medical standards they provided to their own forces. Major Washington arranged for Akiko to send a message to Hiroshi through the American military communication network. The letter would reach him within days, compared to the months it might have taken through any surviving Japanese postal system. More importantly, the Americans offered to provide transportation for family reunifications once medical clearances were obtained. They weren't just helping families communicate, they were actively working to physically reunite them. The education program represented another dimension of American Reconstruction efforts that astounded Akiko's professional sensibilities. Captain Robert Hughes, a former high school principal from Ohio, had been assigned to work with Japanese educators to rebuild the school system. His approach wasn't to impose American educational methods, but to collaborate with Japanese teachers in developing curricula that preserved Japanese cultural heritage, while eliminating militaristic indoctrination and introducing democratic principles. Captain Hughes explained that the American occupation authorities had studied Japanese educational traditions extensively, recognizing their strengths while identifying elements that had contributed to the militaristic culture that led to war. They wanted to preserve Japan's emphasis on discipline, academic excellence, and respect for learning, while introducing concepts of individual rights, critical thinking, and peaceful conflict resolution. The goal was synthesis, not replacement. Akiko's expertise as a mathematics teacher made her immediately valuable to the educational reconstruction effort. Captain Hughes offered her a position helping to redesign mathematics curricula for elementary schools, working to ensure that mathematical concepts were taught as tools for understanding and improving the world, rather than as preparation for military applications. The opportunity to return to teaching, to contribute to her country's future while working with former enemies, represented a possibility she had never imagined. The medical facilities established by American forces revealed yet another dimension of their comprehensive approach to occupation and reconstruction. Dr. Elizabeth Morris, a pediatrician from Boston, had volunteered for overseas duty specifically to treat Japanese children suffering from malnutrition and war-related trauma. Her field hospital was treating over 200 Japanese children daily, providing not just immediate medical care, but long-term rehabilitation programs designed to help children recover from the psychological as well as physical effects of warfare. Dr. Morris's approach to treating Japanese children demonstrated the depth of American preparation for humanitarian responsibilities. She had studied traditional Japanese child-rearing practices, learned about dietary preferences and cultural taboos, and developed treatment protocols that respected Japanese family structures while providing the most advanced medical care available. Her staff included American medics who had been trained in basic Japanese language and customs, ensuring that cultural sensitivity accompanied medical expertise. The psychological transformation occurring in the mothers from the shelter reflected broader changes happening throughout occupied Japan. As word spread about American humanitarian efforts, more Japanese civilians began emerging from hiding places where they had spent weeks or months in terror. Each positive interaction with American forces challenged the propaganda that had shaped their expectations, creating a cascade effect that gradually replaced fear with cautious cooperation. Mrs. Yamamoto, the 18-year-old mother who had been most frightened of American soldiers, became one of the most vocal advocates for cooperation with occupation forces. Her transformation began when Army medics saved her daughter's life by treating a severe respiratory infection that would have been fatal without antibiotics. The gratitude she felt toward the Americans who had preserved her child's life overwhelmed her previous fears and prejudices. The Agricultural Assistance Program represented perhaps the most forward-thinking aspect of American Reconstruction planning. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, an agricultural engineer from Iowa, had brought seeds, fertilizers and farming equipment specifically chosen to help Japanese farmers restore productivity to land damaged by warfare. His team included specialists in soil restoration, crop rotation, and sustainable farming techniques adapted to Japanese climate and terrain conditions. The Americans had calculated that Japan's long-term stability depended on agricultural self-sufficiency, and they were willing to invest significant resources in achieving that goal. They provided not just immediate food aid, but the tools and knowledge necessary for Japanese farmers to feed their own population in the future. This long-term perspective suggested an occupation planning that extended far beyond military control to genuine national reconstruction. As days passed, the shelter that had once housed desperate mothers and dying babies transformed into a temporary community center where Japanese civilians came to access American assistance programs. The space buzzed with activity as families received medical care, educational opportunities, and help reconnecting with relatives. What had begun as a hiding place from feared enemies became a bridge between two nations, learning to build peace together. The most profound change was in the children themselves. Babies who had been slowly starving were now healthy and growing. Older children who had spent months in terror were beginning to play again, their laughter filling spaces that had recently echoed only with crying and despair. The resilience of childhood, supported by adequate nutrition and medical care, demonstrated the remarkable human capacity for recovery when provided with proper conditions. Akiko's role as interpreter and cultural mediator evolved into something approaching leadership within the growing community of Japanese civilians working with American forces. Her ability to explain American intentions to fearful Japanese families, combined with her professional expertise in education, made her invaluable to reconstruction efforts. She found herself serving as a bridge between two cultures, learning to understand each other. The evening conversations in the former shelter now included American soldiers sharing stories about their own families, their hopes for the future, and their reasons for volunteering for overseas service. These personal connections humanized both sides of the former conflict, revealing common desires for peace, prosperity, and family security that transcended national boundaries and previous enmities. One particularly moving conversation involved Sergeant O'Brien showing photographs of his own children to the Japanese mothers. His 3-year-old son and infant daughter looked remarkably similar to the Japanese children he was helping to save. The universality of parental love, the shared experience of caring for vulnerable children, created bonds that made former enemies into collaborators in protecting the innocent. As March drew to a close, Akiko received word that arrangements had been completed for her reunion with Hiroshi. The American military would provide transportation to Osaka, where she and Yuki would be reunited with husband and father after 8 months of separation and uncertainty. The journey would take them through a Japan being rebuilt through unprecedented cooperation between former enemies. The mathematics of hope had replaced the mathematics of despair in Akiko's daily calculations. Instead of measuring survival time against diminishing resources, she was now planning for a future that included education, family reunification, and meaningful work contributing to her country's peaceful reconstruction. The Americans had demonstrated that victory could include compassion, that strength could be expressed through generosity, and that former enemies could become partners in building a better world. The story that began with a desperate mother following the scent of rice had evolved into something much larger, a testament to the human capacity for transformation, the power of compassion to overcome hatred, and the possibility of building peace from the ashes of warfare. The American soldiers who could have been conquerors chose instead to be healers, and in doing so, they changed not just Japan, but the very definition of what victory could mean. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.